Good morning, everyone. Uh, this is Darwin Salazar, and I'll be your moderator for today. Today's webinar will focus on fraud prevention with user behavior analytics brought to you by Veriato. Christine will be our other host. And Christine, could you confirm that you could see my screen correctly?
Yes, I can see your screen and I can hear you perfectly. Thanks.
Awesome. Alrighty, so as I mentioned before, my name is Darwin. I've had years of experience spanning in the cybersecurity industry, spanning the automotive, medical device, public policy, and insurance industries. During my years in grad school, I also focused on emerging technologies, including the impacts that artificial intelligence had on anti-money laundering and fraud prevention. And Christine, if you don't mind, I think your experience is very extensive in the cybersecurity industry, and I could go on for days, kind of just giving a rundown on everything you've done in this ever-evolving industry. But if you want to, you could give a quick synopsis of everything you've done.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Christine Izuakor. I worked in several different domains when it comes to security, be it, vulnerability management, training and awareness. I focus a lot on people, security strategy, and more. And so I'm super excited to be here and talk about something that is growing very rapidly in importance, which is fraud prevention and user behavior analytics. I think this will be a really good and insightful discussion, and I look forward to jumping right in.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And so today we'll focus on four main topics within fraud prevention and digital fraud more specifically. So we'll zone in on the state of digital fraud today in 2019 and going forward. Also, the common and main culprits behind digital fraud. Other things we'll focus on are the deception tactics you should look out for when conducting analysis within your networks and infrastructures and trying to discover fraud and any anomalies that go with insider threats. And then also we'll end off with methods of prevention and detection of fraud. So before we do dive in and conduct a deep dive on of the topics we've just discussed, I'd like to kind of just highlight over these very astounding statistics that we were able to discover. And I think, Christine, during your research, you were able to really dive into these and truly get a deep understanding of just how massive and, I guess, eye-opening digital fraud is. And so would you mind diving into like these reports, the Raconteur and the FBI Internet Crime Report, please?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And if you wouldn't mind, I'm not sure if there's a technical glitch on our end with the slides. Moving over to the first slide, or the third slide with the stats.
There may be a technical glitch.
Yeah, I think for the audience, what we're seeing is just the main cover. While we work to figure that out, I can definitely, jump in and start to share a little bit more about what we've. Oh.
Here we go.
Yeah, still showing the cover slide here, but again, I'll just continue. Oh, awesome, it's up now. So yeah, to touch on these slides or these statistics, we've seen, $26 billion in terms of the cost of business email fraud over the last 3 years. 50% of companies have become victims of fraud. And then that last stat was pretty interesting, which I'll come back to. But I think what I find the most alarming about the first number here, this 26 billion, is that we know fraud happens in many ways, right? And 26 billion that's been reported is, focusing solely on email compromise. And so when you think about how that number can grow with all the other social engineering tactics criminals use, like vishing for voice-based attacks or smishing for SMS slash text-based attacks. This is costing companies a fortune, and there's so much potential for this number to be even larger. I'm also not surprised by the 50% number, because quite honestly, it's a lot easier to pull these attacks off. In prior webinars, I've talked about ransomware as a service and some of these dark services that are starting to pop up more, and fraud is no exception. So you'll see underground kind of dark companies who are doing fraud as a service, which makes it a lot easier for attackers to craft and to launch fraud attempts without having the technical skills or a lot of background in the space. What I am surprised by, however, is that last stat regarding finance. So in a study or a comparison of the highest fraud costs across different sectors, finance came in at 9th place. And I found that alarming, but before I jump into that, let me take a step back and even just talk about fraud in general. So to level set on definition and what we're talking about here, this is really a form of digital crime that involves deception, often for financial or personal gain of attackers, and that fraud can be targeted at a variety of different groups and industries. So, for example, individual consumers, we see this quite a bit. They can become victims of fraud when people steal their personal information, whether it's directly or through a breach of a corporation. And so we see this time and time again. Attackers will use that information to open new credit card accounts, file fraudulent tax returns, and so on. But for corporations, and what we're focusing a little bit more on for this webinar, corporations are, of course, also common targets for this fraud. And so going back to that last statistic, we're seeing the targets evolve quite a bit. So most people would assume that, it's common and that most of the fraud happens in the finance sector and in banking. After all, quite honestly, that's where all of the money is, no matter what other industry might be feeding it in. And so the interesting thing is that with the digital transformation that's happening across a variety of industries, that's enabled greater success of some of these fraud attacks, whether you're targeting the financial sector or not. And so of those 14 sectors that were evaluated through this report, the cost of fraud was not the highest in banking or finance, but more so in energy and in professional services, in manufacturing and construction, and some of these areas that, for me at least, I wouldn't think of as the first place where there would be these significant amounts of fraud. And so at the same time, if you look at the data a little bit further, you see that the most frequent and costly cases often include so accounting groups or areas that are associated with finance. And so it's not to say that there's a shift away from finance altogether, and that industry is definitely still at risk. But the scope has really expanded to where people are looking anywhere and everywhere to launch some of these lucrative attacks. And I think that makes sense. Finance is a heavily regulated industry, right? And people in those or companies in those spaces are usually already investing a ton in security and fraud prevention, and so the chances of success for attackers are a little bit lower. And so now they're looking elsewhere at those finance teams or other departments within every industry, and even looking at companies of a variety of sizes, whether large, medium-sized, or small business. This isn't just impacting large banks anymore. There's such a huge expansion of the scope here. And so what this ends up looking like in other industries, if you think about like healthcare, for example, fraud could entail, someone billing for, medical drugs or anything like that authorized beyond the scope of their work. Or if you look at the education sector, for example, people commit student loan fraud. This could also be, if you think about, tech companies or any company, it could be employees who are stealing computing power in order to run a side business. It could be an employee outsourcing their job overseas and still collecting a paycheck from you for work that they aren't doing. There's so many different angles and facets when it comes to fraud, and all of these examples are things that are happening every single day. And so these statistics are all pretty interesting, and I think they paint this picture that the growth and evolution in this space is pretty massive.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Christine. And we cover it at a high level and just glossing over the many, every single industry is impacted by digital fraud. And I think another thing that we should consider are the main culprits of digital fraud. I think from the outside looking in, one may think it's the potentially the nation state actor launching automated attacks from uh, X, Y, or Z country or whatever the case may be. But really, peeling back the onion layers here, I think we should also look internally and at the insider threat. And so I've heard you in the past, Christine, speak about how behind every single cyber attack, there, no matter how much technology is leveraged, there's always a human being involved and someone initiating those clicks and those attacks from behind the screen. It's like in this ever evolving world of where we're reaching quantum computing and 5G and artificial intelligence and these automated attacks, there is always someone that has to insert the script to launch that attack. And so I think one stat that we came across that was eye popping was that, and this one came from the Raconteur fraud report, is that 100% of companies that were assessed for user threat profiles were discovered active insider threats. And so an insider threat at a very high level is anyone ranging from an employee who is conducting abnormal or unauthorized activities. The employee may be naive or just clicking around on a website that has ads with viruses or whatever the case may be, ranging to the a very, I guess, nefarious insider threat who has knowledge of your trade secrets and knows how your cloud infrastructure is architected. And so that person may be able to, if let's say disgruntled for whatever reason, may be able to leverage that knowledge about your infrastructure and carry out an attack which may be crippling to your entity. And so it's not only the nation state actor or the script kiddie or the like the other folks in the black hoodies that you see on the news, but it's also your insider threat, which may be sitting right next to you in the office. So, Christine, I think there's millions of threat actor profiles if we really wanted to drill down on this. But would you mind sharing some real world examples or things of that nature?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can talk to kind of the many faces that we see behind digital fraud and some examples there. I think, you hit the nail right on the head. We see most attacks, including fraud, are usually carried out by insiders. From the one report, we found 60% of them, which makes conversations around insider threats super important when you start talking about fraud in corporations. Um, in addition, the fact that 100% of companies assessed discovered that they had an active insider threat within their organizations. I mean, that sounds like such a high and definitive stat. It's quite alarming, and I'll come back to that in a second. But it's usually employees who have been around for a while, right? We're seeing that the minimum tenure of the employees who are inflicting some of these insider threats or some of this fraud, they usually have been with the company for a minimum of 5 years or more. And so these threats are people who know the ins and outs of the company, who know things very well. And of course, this can make attacks that are successful even more expensive. And so the average of a breach or an incident that stems from an insider threat is almost $8 million. And so to answer this question of who's really behind the fraud, there's both internal and external threat actors, right? Unfortunately, the most damaging cases again usually come from within. I'll address the external threats first briefly, and then spend a little more time on insiders and that 100% notion. So for external threats, that can be anyone, right? That can be, your external cyber criminals. It could be hacktivists. You mentioned nation state actors and more. And these groups operate for a variety of different reasons when it comes to fraud. specifically, but the motivation is usually, for the most part, like I mentioned in the beginning, financial gain. Insiders are an interesting extension because they can be any of those external parties, and they can have the same motives. They're just now within your organization and have some level of authorized access to your systems to make it easier to commit fraud. And so, for example, we've seen nation state actors who help get people into companies as employees, so that your external threat is now effectively an insider. Adding to the problem is the fact that even the most reliable and seemingly harmless employees can change in an instant or can evolve throughout that 5 years they've been with the company or 10 years they've been at the company to pose a threat. And so because of their insider knowledge, that becomes even more difficult to manage. And some of the usual recommendations around, make sure you do background checks and all of that is great, but again, people evolve over time, and so that of course doesn't solve. It helps, but doesn't solve everything. Now, this notion that 100% of companies have active insider threats, I'd be curious to see what others think about this. So feel free, if you're listening and have comments or questions, to add any of those in. But the idea is, if you're working with human beings, there is always going to be an insider threat. We can't control or predict human beings to a certain extent, and so that's always going to be there, and we have to be able to have the insight and the knowledge to manage it. And so I almost feel like if you don't feel like you have any insider threats in your company, again, I would love to get insight on how you accomplish that, or what the thought process is there. One of the challenges is that preventing fraud requires an understanding of the various profiles and the people who exist and their motivations. And so I like to give threat actors kind of fun names to describe their profiles, and share some of the common culprits that could be behind some of this fraud. And so first up, we have who I call disgruntled Daisy, who you hinted to a little bit earlier too. But this is the employee who either didn't get the performance rating that they wanted or the raise that they wanted, and they decide to retaliate. This became a harsh reality for Tesla one summer, when an angry employee stole the company's information and started to share it with different third parties, compromising some of their most sensitive intellectual property. Another kind of profile here is who we call Terminated Tina. So we've all heard these stories of companies who are noticing activity from an account of someone who's been recently terminated. And so as Terminated Tina departs from the company, she's creating these backdoors and tries to regain access to systems for future use and for potential fraud. This is an unfortunate reality that happens quite often, as basic as it may seem, especially for people who are cybersecurity experts and know that the minute somebody is terminated, they need to lose all system access and things like that. But we still see these happen on a regular basis. One real example there is we had an ex-employee of a company called Allen and Hoschel, who continued to access the company's files for 2 years after he left the company. And so he was able to export all of this intellectual property worth almost $500,000. And unfortunately, this mishap landed him in jail as a result of that as well. Another kind of profile or culprit that we usually see when it comes to fraud is who I call Malicious Malory. And so this is one of the more obvious ones. Unfortunately, some insiders are just downright criminals. And so whether it's being driven by financial hardship, greed, substance abuse, there's all kinds of reasons, but employees steal from their employers for numerous reasons. And so these are the employees who are deliberately looking to breach a company's security and take advantage. Again, it's a real threat. It happens all the time. Unfortunately, even the best employees can sometimes make poor decisions. And a real example that we saw of this is an employee from Punjab National Bank, which I'll just refer to as PNB from this point forward. But through this fraud scheme, he got banks to cough up $1.8 billion in fraudulent transactions. And so this employee was able to organize, fake loan requests, which prompted two banks to provide these loans to PNB. And the employee admitted that the way that they did this is they had unauthorized password access to the systems that you use to issue these letters. So they had to issue fake letters. And it's a system that typically only a select group of senior leaders in the company have access to. And so not only did he admit to sharing to using that unauthorized access, but to sharing it with others within the company, and even sharing some of those credentials with staff at a third-party company that sort of orchestrated the greater plan. And so it's another prime example of insider threats that are malicious in nature and lead to fraud that is super costly. Another one that I talk about a lot, and Darwin, you alluded to this as well, is Oblivious Omar. And this is the employee who has no clue that they're introducing risks to the organization. So majority of security incidents usually start with human error, and these insider threats, of course, are not always malicious in nature. Often they stem from everyday employees who just don't know much about cyber risk, or equally importantly, how to protect against them. And so they may unintentionally aid in the success of these fraud schemes. For example, an employee being asked to wire a suspicious amount of money to an account, whether it's through email or from another trusted employee who it does actually have bad intentions. And so this, oblivious person just isn't paying close enough attention to realize what's really going on. And this is something that I personally have seen happen so many times, where these different fraud attempts. And I'm sure many people who are listening hear about these or deal with them as well. And then finally, the last one that I like to touch on, and granted, of course, this is not an exhaustive list. Like you mentioned, there's tons of different threat profiles, but I find these to be the ones that are most common when it comes to fraud. Finally, we have who I call third-party patty. And this is just highlights the fact that someone doesn't have to be a full-time employee in your organization to commit fraud, right? Third-party contractors, vendors, they often have similar access privileges that insiders have and employees have. They're just not directly, employed by the company. And so that's another thing to keep in mind. But one last interesting stat that I'll share, and these people can fall in any of these categories that I've talked about, but a report done by Carnegie Mellon found that executives are one of the biggest kind of drivers when it comes to fraud. So this report found that 32% of threat actors in fraudulent cases were company owners or executives. And so, executives often have the highest levels of authority and a host of other access levels that can actually enable fraud. And so while, of course, in every company, nobody wants to see or suspect or allude to some of those things, that it's a fact. It's what data is showing us. And so I say that to say that no group or no one should be exempt from the discussion around who can actually be behind some of these fraudulent attacks.
Awesome. Thanks for that rundown, Christine. And I think here we show the financial impact that insider threat attacks or fraud may cause, but I think it's also crippling to the reputation sometimes. And so you cover the five main buckets that I think these insider threats fall under. I think it goes down to a person who may be terminated, disgruntled, or just outright malicious and nefarious, and potentially collaborating with someone externally to either steal trade secrets, impact the company's financials or reputation, or whatever the intended purpose of that fraud or attack may be. And then there's the oblivious individual and third party patty. And so with Today's, I guess, ever evolving technology, it seems like there's an arms race that is going on between the fraudsters, the attackers, and the good guys, the folks on the inside within the company trying to protect the networks and the company's crown jewels, and ensuring that the integrity of the product or service that the organization entity is offering is 100% secure and delivered up to standard. And so today, this is a stat that has been slowly diminishing. I think back in 2015, it was up near the high 200s. But in 2018, it was reported that it usually takes an average of 197 days to detect a breach. And this breach may be caused by someone external or internal, but I think that when we dive into this number and look at the how long it takes to detect an insider a breach caused by an insider threat, that number of days tends to be shorter. But I also believe that insider threats are more elusive and more deceptive when it comes to covering their tracks, because they may know the infrastructure and much better than an outsider, and they also may know where the logs lay and erasing those. And so Christine, if you, could you dive into what you've seen in the past and your years in the industry, in terms of common evasion tactics and deception tactics?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So this one still kind of blows my mind. The fact that it's an average of 197 days to detect a breach. When I, kind of think and relate it back to myself personally, like removing the digital aspect, like just imagine like someone breaks into your home and they quietly empty out your safe, leave everything clean and intact like it was when they arrived, and you don't realize what happened until 6 months later. Like that's essentially what this is, just in digital form. And so again, it's kind of mind blowing to me. But whether it's a physical or digital heist, so to speak, people committing fraud, especially these insiders, they usually don't want to get caught. And so they'll try to make the system look exactly like it did before they gained access to avoid that, which makes it a little bit harder. But anything they can do to lengthen the discovery time to that 197 days or even more. I think two of the most popular approaches to covering tracks that we see are people who are trying to behave as normally as possible on the network, so you don't trigger alerts, right, or create any abnormal log activity. So think of old movies, Jewel Thief is, doing what I call upwards and downwards limbo to, get over the red beams so that they don't trigger those alerts when they're trying to break into something. And so it's kind of the same case here digitally. Cyber criminals are trying to get through those beams and get through those alerts so that they don't trigger alerts. And the other thing when you talk about insider threats is that they usually have better ideas of where those beams are so that they can better avoid them. And so in the digital space, this could be in terms of some very basic examples, obfuscating the origins of traffic. Think spoofing, think Tor browsing to hide activities and stuff like that. The second is, of course, deleting any traces of the activity or what has been done whenever that's possible. So you'll see them, if they have the right access, are able to gain the right access, modifying, deleting, destroying logs, deleting any temporary accounts that they created to commit fraud, deleting any files associated with that activity, and so on. And of course, attackers are also continuing to get more and more creative in how they do that. And so, for example, you'll see some attackers are now using ransomware to cover their tracks and to hide some of the activity or fraud that they're doing. So if you think about how ransomware works, right? It locks up or encrypts files, right? And you would need the keys essentially to decrypt that data or have your backups or so on in order to address that issue. But when attackers are now using this to encrypt log files so that you actually can't see the activity or what's been done, they're now using it to cover their tracks. And whether you pay the ransom or not, they don't plan to unlock it because they don't want you to see evidence of what has been done on the network. And so, again, these attackers are getting more creative with how they try to cover their tracks. But another thing that I want to touch on here as well is the concept of false negatives when it comes to insider threats and this idea of kind of hiding in plain sight. So these are cases where there's a threat actor who's a true outsider, not one of your employees, but has gained access to the credentials of your employee. And so they're doing activities that appear normal, and a traditional system probably wouldn't catch it, but they aren't. So, for example, let's say Susie uses her employee badge and swipes in at your data center at 9 p.m. every day to cover the night shift, and so that's normal behavior. It's what she always does. It's fine. And so today she swiped her badge at 9 p.m. and that's very normal, only based on her phone geolocation. She's on vacation in Greece right now, and so does someone who's not Susie have her badge, or is Susie's phone vacationing and taking pictures and stuff without her? And so without having the right, insight and being able to correlate data from different places and stuff, it can be hard to begin to distinguish what's truly malicious versus not. On a separate example, let's say there's an external cyber criminal, so of course not one of your insiders, and somehow they've gained access to your employee payroll login information, and now they're committing fraud. And this is actually something we've seen happen, but they're now committing fraud by updating payroll deposit information in different employees' accounts and linking that back to an account that's untraceable. And so that's something where, again, if you're using the employee's real credentials from a system standpoint, if you're only looking at that one data point, it might look like it's fine when it's really not. And so my point is that some attackers try to hide in plain sight that way by engaging in things that are seemingly normal and authorized activity. And so this makes managing the risk, especially when it comes to this concept of false negatives, super challenging, because without the right technologies and capabilities to detect and prevent some of these instances, it becomes a greater challenge. Before we go on to kind of the next topic, I just did a quick look into the question window, and I see one question asking about the slides and whether they're going to be shared or available after, and they will be available after. So look out for that. And also, if anybody else has other questions or things that you want to comment on, please again feel free to add those in the question area.
Awesome, thanks, Christine. And so in diving into the next topic and finding ways to, one, detect these elusive and deception tactics that insider threat or an external threat may use, I think it boils down to several things and potentially basic controls and measures that one organization can take, and those basic tenets must be done very well. And so here we have 6 tips, and it boils down to hiring good people. And Christine, I think you'll dive into them a bit much better than I would. But here are the 6. Before I hand it off to you, though, I do want to cover some more at a technical level rather than like going down to the practices. And so Terminated Tina, I think one way to kind of try and avoid that is by enabling remote wipe on BYOD devices or laptops, so that an employee that is now terminated no longer has access to data that she did while with the organization. And there's also file integrity monitoring that may be an agent that you deploy onto your crown jewels on those files in order to be able to monitor who is actually accessing these files and editing and modifying these files. Another thing I think is acceptable use policies. How do you want or do not want your employees to use web services, and what emails and types of emails to look out for and indicators in those. And then also implementing segregation of duties. I know it's touched on here on point 4, but you do not want a lower level analyst with administrator privileges. And so there's a lot that we can do to try and mitigate and prevent against these insider threats and their deceptive tactics. And Christine, is there more that you'd like to add on the best practices side? I know that also number 6 covers the third party, and that would be third party Patty, which I think it's a funny moniker to kind of highlight there. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think you touched on quite a few of the important points. I mean, of course, hiring good people sounds basic. It sounds like common sense, but that's proven to be a challenge for some corporations, and so definitely something to keep in mind. Also, I mentioned before, I focus a lot on the human element when it comes to security, and sometimes teaching people what to do and what not to do makes all the difference. Because again, some of these threats are not always malicious in nature. Sometimes it's just employees who aren't aware of some of the risks that they're exposing the company to. From a policies and standards process, having those clear expectations and guidelines can eliminate gray areas that employees are sure about. So you want to make moral dilemmas and decisions very clear and very straightforward through documentation and guidance. Segregation of duties, you touched on already, but making sure you have those checks and balances, or multiple employees and teams are involved in validating transactions and things, especially in high risk areas. And then I think one of the bigger ones, and I'll talk about this a little bit more when we transition into the detection side, but having a strong technology stack. And I can't emphasize enough layers. Like, make sure that there's a holistic cybersecurity strategy that includes different functions, like your firewalls, and your identity and access management is a big in this space, to make sure people don't have unauthorized access to information, and it's not easy to create some of these new accounts or elevate access, least privilege, all of those things. And then, of course, we can't forget third parties and the damages that they can do.
Awesome. Thank you, Christine. And now we've highlighted how to prevent, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into how to actually detect fraud. And being able to detect fraud as accurately and as quickly as possible can either make or break a company's ability to recover from an attack, reputationally and financially. And I think one of the key ways that I'd like to highlight that an organization may be able to detect fraud is by developing a baseline of what is accepted user behavior. And with that baseline, you'd be able to, depending on the technologies that you're using throughout your environment and your organization, you'd be able to detect anomalies and things that are out of the ordinary. And so that's where I really think user behavior analytics can come in and help, and especially when pairing this in with artificial intelligence and training your technology with as much data sets and data points as possible would really be allow you to help detect a fraud or any abnormal activity that may infer fraud is very important. And so, Christine, I know on the detection side, you've done a fair amount of research and have a lot going on your end when it comes to the actual detection of digital fraud. And so I'd like to hear your viewpoints on the best practices there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, these three buckets are great places to start. Enterprise visibility is super important. Um, because these attacks, especially like they're stemming from insiders who know the ins and outs of systems, it can be very difficult to accurately detect, right? And so I always say the table stakes are you can't protect what you can't see, especially when your attacker knows your environment just as well, if not better than you know it. And so enterprise visibility and knowing your assets becomes very critical. You can't see fraud happening on assets that you don't know are there or that you don't have data and logs on. Like the basis of all of this is that you need to be, in order to effectively use analytics or able to apply artificial intelligence or some of those things that you mentioned earlier. In order to apply those things, you have to have data to analyze, and so that's where visibility becomes kind of a table stakes like foundation for making that happen. And so, starting by knowing what your assets are, who has access to them, and all of that is important. But I would also say, like, remember that people are assets as well. And so when we talk about insider threats, and the knowing what your assets are in the company, like that applies to your people as well, and understanding that they can be a part of those threats. And then next is just embracing the evolution of fraud detection and using this concept of UBA, or user behavior analytics based solutions. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about UBA in general, because when it's done right, it can be super powerful. Now, it's not completely new, right? So the concept of behavior analytics really gained popularity back in the early 2000s, but it was primarily used for tracking, consumer behavior for marketing and for sales and things like that. But over time, we started to see these powerful use cases popping up in, the gaming industry or in social media, and eventually in cybersecurity and in applications for fraud detection and prevention. And so if we know that there's already tons of data being collected and ingested from different systems when it comes to logs, then you can begin to apply artificial intelligence algorithms and things like that to further break down and better understand behavior of users. And so when it comes to cybersecurity and fraud detection, for UBA, the fundamental operating principle is to create this picture of what does normal user behavior look like, in order to know what can be considered abnormal. And so once you have that baseline to compare against, you can begin to alert on suspicious behavior. Now, creating that baseline of what normal looks like, that can be accomplished, of course, by collecting data on different data points like the username, your accounts and access permissions, locations, titles, and so on. And then this gets overlaid with information regarding actions that are completed by the user, like transaction types, session duration, time of day, geographical location, all those things. And once you can begin to bring all of that data together and learn from it in real time and continue to adapt, that's where this can begin to make a huge difference, and already is making a huge difference when it comes to fraud detection. And so using this and relating it back to our prior example of Susie, who's swiping her badge at the data center, but she's on vacation and her phone is pinging from Greece. But so that can be considered abnormal, right? But the challenge is that abnormal doesn't always mean malicious, and I think that's another way that when we talk about user behavior analytics and making some of these tools more intelligent, where it really starts to make a difference. So what if Susie is, what if she's really at the data center at 9 p.m. and let's say this might be a little far-fetched, but let's say her, mom is the one vacationing in Greece, and, because Susie has an international call plan, she let her mom borrow her phone or something to save her money. And so, they're actually from Greece, she's there, once a quarter. So this is a habit. This is something that a machine or an algorithm can pick up on. Now, again, this is abnormal. That example might be a little bit messy. People might ask, why does her company have her geolocation on her personal phone, or why is she even giving her mom her phone? But all that aside, the point being, though it's not a perfect scenario, that transaction wasn't malicious, even if it looked strange. And so with UBA, when you can take into consideration, thousands of other data points, both real-time and historical, You can use all of that to try to more accurately figure out, what's going on here. And without that intelligent context, some of the more traditional anomaly-based tools often got flooded with a ton of false positives, and confusing situations like this one I just mentioned would require more human analysis and more human interaction in order to understand. And I almost cringe at the thought of it, because I lived that life very early in my career, dealing with millions of false positives at one time in a tool that I was managing. But what I like, and the shift that we're seeing, is that with modern technology and with tools that are based on UBA and things like that, there's these advanced ways of overcoming this age old challenge to more accurately pinpoint abnormal behavior that is likely malicious. So in other words, you can get better at detecting fraudulent activity while avoiding these never-ending and overwhelming alerts, false positives, and things that once plagued some of the more traditional tools. And the way that happens, there's of course quite a few telltale signs that can suggest fraud is going on, right? Some common examples could be when you have a single device that's using multiple different user credentials on a network, or the opposite of that, when you have different devices from varying locations using the same credentials, elevations in access for normal users, and so on. Those are all triggers. Even that last trigger I mentioned on different devices using the same login credentials. If we go back to the PNB bank example that I mentioned, where the insider employee was able to get away with a $1.8 billion kind of bank heist scenario, if he shared those credentials with both other employees in the company as well as external parties, that's something that this technology should be able to pick up on, right, in order to avoid things like that from happening. However, of course, attackers are also getting creative in how they, again, mask their activity so they don't trigger these alarms like we talked about a little bit earlier on. And so if a company's kind of detection capability is limited to some of these obvious signs, it's simply not enough in today's environment. And so when you have, again, the technology that can be more intelligent in overlaying some of the relevant context and learn in real time and accurately escalate some of the risky behavior, that's where it starts to really make a difference. Another benefit of UBA in this case is that by focusing on individual user activity, no matter which group the user falls within, and no matter what kind of culprit profile, like all of the different names we talked about earlier, companies can gain more insight into what's actually happening. And so this addresses the challenge of false negatives when you have the right context and the right data behind it. Because the relevant question then becomes, using all of this data and context that's available, how risky is this transaction for this user or for this resource? Like, regardless of if it's, really them or if it's somebody who's impersonating them and using their credentials. And so I think that really makes a difference in this case. And then the last thing that I will add here is focusing more on the actual insider threat strategy. So we've spent quite a bit of time talking about visibility in UBA, but we can't leave insider out, right? So knowing that a lot of these threats come from within, you have to have a strong program. We talked earlier about 100% of companies having this active threat. But on the flip side, I saw one report from Crowd Research Partners that showed that only 36% of companies have an insider threat program established. And so that's a bit concerning. So there's all these threats and there's not really a lot of programs out there to address them. And so I've already touched on a lot of the different elements for an insider threat strategy, so I won't spend too much more time on this, but some additional key elements to consider are, your employee investigations process, how you respond when you do find an insider threat, and so on. The last thing that I do want to highlight is the importance of technology that can produce evidence. So according to that same report I referenced earlier, 80% of insiders who are involved in incidents are unprosecuted because of a lack of evidence. And so without that, you have no case. It's a lot harder to really navigate. And so it's important to know that, when you're using some of these UBA-based insider threat technologies, you can also gain the benefit of having, the right evidence if you need to, pursue legal action or anything like that. And that, I would say, wraps up all that I have to add here. And I know that we also have someone from Veriato for those who, want more information on how you can actually leverage some of this information and actually take action on it, who will now take over to share some of that.
Awesome, Christine. Yeah, and I think you covered that pretty well. With first, you need to know. I would equate detecting user fraud as finding a needle in a haystack, and if you don't know which haystack you're looking at, or it's going to be it's going to be impossible to find that needle. And so, with that said, we'll hand it over to Mike Reider, Senior Systems and Sales Engineer from Veriato, and he'll highlight more ways to technically detect and discover um, insider threat and digital fraud.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mike.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike. I am the sales engineer here at Veriato. I hope you see my screen here.
Yes, we can.
Yes, awesome. Okay. So kind of touching back on, what she was talking about, our software encompasses kind of both the endpoint monitoring and the behavior analytics. We kind of base our process here. First we watch, then we analyze. We will alert you. You can see it, and then you can react to it. So these are all the things that we watch for. Everything from file transfers, document tracking to printer outside, cloud USB storage or outside USB storage, online searches, emails, keystrokes, websites, the whole nine. We use psycholinguistics as part of our behavioral analytics, which can detect your tone. So if normally you're happy in your emails all the time, then all of a sudden one day you start getting really negative, we will pick it up and we will alert you on it. So here's an example. Can we see the risk scores?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect.
Melanie, Paul, Tara.
Excellent. So say for example, this is our brand new risk score implementation. We baseline for about almost a month, and then we start putting together risk scores that what we deem may or may not be risky to you. So you can see we separate. So here's the high risk people. So take Sarah Sullivan for example. So over here on the 7-day risk trend, no issues here, and then all of a sudden update one day it spikes up, and she becomes a super high risk. Now here you can see the top indicators in this sample data. It's online searches and then websites. And then we will actually display alerts down here if there's something that you should know. You can dig a little deeper, and then we'll bring up the records. There's nothing here right now, but it will show you what exactly it's basing that on. If you want to break it down even more, here she is. Here's her risk history for the past 30 days. And then this actually tells you what it's basing these risk scores on down here. And then again, you can go and actually view the records in the database. So let me switch screens. Okay. So say for instance, you come in, you see the high risk score, or you can come in, you check your email, and you get this alert here, this doc track an anomaly. Our anomaly alerts are behavior analytics. It watches you for a same thing about a month, and then starts putting together a cumulative baseline of what is or isn't normal activity on a day-to-day basis for either that user or compared to themselves or a group. So here we have an anomaly alert for document tracking. So you can see that cloud storage uploads, printed documents, attachments, and moved out of the domain. Normally she does about one a day. Now she's up to 3. And we'll also have a report that we can actually email you, and you can see it in a report as well. Or for example, we also have keyword alerts. So if you do specify keywords such as, let's say in this case, confidential is a document name. And we also have pre-populated lists, so such as fraud. And it has some different terms here to watch out for that you can enable. You can also modify and add to this yourself if there's anything specific that you would like to look for. So we get these alerts. It's all pointing to Tara clearly. So we can go down to the users and find her specifically. This is where all her data is going to be stored. Everything populated here is data that we have for this user. So we saw that she was doing document tracking. So we'll go to her documents, and this will bring up everything that she's done with documents within the network. So you can see the creates, which are essentially copies, deletes, edits, or renames. And you can come down and there's your confidential customer lists. So say she's stealing customer lists with sensitive customer data, potentially, identity theft, whatever the case might be. And then you can actually view the screenshot and you can see that she's copying it right there. You can play it, and then, well, we see this guy pops up, and we can actually see that she's colluding with this gentleman as well. So now you found the source of the issue, and you have the evidence. It's right there in a print screen, and you have everything you need. There's much more that this can do. Feel free to contact our sales department if you feel you would like a higher level demo. We'll be happy to provide you that and answer any questions that you may or may not have. And we'll give it back to Christine at this point, or Darwin.
Yeah, sure. That concludes today's webinar. Thanks everyone for joining.